welcome to this very special webinar, actually. Little too close for comfort. And it's organized by Foundation for India Studies, FIS. And today is Sunday, November 3rd afternoon. I will be the event chair for today. And we have some technical support headed by Astha Sharma. And a couple of guys are supposed to be coming to support me, but they have not shown up yet. And I think one Mr. Vabilala Chandra might be there in the East Coast. So we'll start with that. And now, as you all know, the subject is how will Indian Americans vote in 2024 US election? It's a hot button topic. It's not only all of us, the US citizens, it's a civic duty, but I think it is more consequential than being ever in a century, probably, which way we lead ourselves in US and the world at large. And we couldn't have anybody else than these two persons, the speaker, Dr. Milan Vaishnav, and he is from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he's the, let me see, he's a senior fellow and the director of the South Asia program and the host of the Grand Tamasha podcast, which I don't know, but I look up to it, at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And there are a lot of other credentials. He currently lives in Geneva with his family, and he's from Washington, D.C. And it's really a pleasure to have him here with us today. And we have another person. He becomes my favorite immediately because he supports a group called NPR. Most of you know probably, National Public Radio. And he is Arun Venugopal, and who is a senior reporter in the Race and Justice Unit at WNYC in New York, and is a long-term expert on Indian American community. And as I said, I got my two favorite places. These two are from Houston. And now, before we move on to the real tech stuff or interesting stuff, I'd like to quickly say I am the event chair, as I told. I also serve in FIS board, and along with me here, Sudhakar Talabazulla. He is also one of the board directors, director of the board, and Amanda Vabilala. She is one of our advisors, and the last but not the least, I would like to introduce you to Krishna Vabilala. I call him Evergreen founder, chairperson of FIS since he started in 2005. And he's the man behind everything happening in FIS, and had been a lot of good work, actually. I was involved since 2015. And he and FIS have been conferred with many awards over the years. I'm not going to list you all of those. And last year, he was conferred with the Presidential Lifetime Achievement Award. And nothing could be more than that. So that's why I mentioned about that. Now, may I request Krishnaji to say, as brief as possible, few words about Foundation for India Studies. Krishna.
Thank you, Hiren. I appreciate your kind words. And on behalf of the Foundation for India Studies and its board members, I thank you all, those who are all attending now on a Sunday to participate in our program. And we appreciate your time. And for those of you who do not know FIS, which stands for Foundation for India Studies. It's a 18-year-old non-profit organization established in Houston, Texas. And we have a variety of programs throughout these years. We have a signature project called the Indo-American Oral History Project, which is recording the life histories of the first generation Indian immigrants into Houston and the Harris County, and of course also the Fort Bend County. So all these oral histories are videographed, transcribed, and archived in the Houston Public Library's Metropolitan Research Center. This particular project has also received a Mary Fay Barnes Award of Excellence from the Texas Oral History Association. The other impactful project we have is called the Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's event is part of those series where we invite eminent speakers. We started off with Nobel laureate Professor Sudarshan from Austin University, and we invited diplomats, including Consul General of Israel, Consul General of India. We gave our platform to exchange ideas and the commonalities with India and Indian diaspora. And we also participate in Martin Luther King Jr. birthday celebrations downtown in the parade. In 2015, we had received the Grand Marshal Award. These are all proud moments for us. And many such programs, of course, noteworthy are our establishment of India Studies program in University of Houston, and also we initiated a similar program in the Texas Southern University 2 years ago. So talking about these accomplishments, we feel proud that the community has supported us all these years. And without their support, we would not have been able to carry out our programs. And again, thank you very much for being here. And Hiren, back to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Krishnaji. Just quickly, the rest of the agenda will Dr. Vaishnav is going to start his presentation. Yeah, and after that, Arunji is going to put some questions to him from his side. And then the platform will be opened by Arunji to take questions from the participants. Okay, just simple two house rules. One is we would like to request all the participants who want to ask questions, as you hear some questions arise, please put it in the, I believe it's called chat box or whatever, in the chatting section, write it down, and Arun is going to collect those and put those questions to Vaishnav later on. Then the other thing, FIS is generally a kind of neutral organization in all aspects. We don't take sides or don't make our opinions from as an organization. So these are kind of, there could be some controversial questions. And I will let Arun and Dr. Vaishnav to handle it as they go. And if we find that it is getting too far, which has happened to us, that's what I'm saying. So I will take the liberty to just stop it there and move on. And at the end of it, I request Sudhakar to give the vote of thanks for the participants. And Dr. Vaishnav, over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen since I'm going to show you some slides. Can everyone see that? Is that appearing okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let me start by saying how great it is to be with FIS again. I participated in a similar event 4 years ago, so it's nice to be invited back. It's especially nice to share the virtual stage with Arun, whose voice I get to listen to on the radio and occasionally get to talk to as well, and look forward to his questions and comments later on. What I'm going to do with the time that I have today is to provide a kind of summary of findings of a recent survey that my colleagues and I carried out called the 2024 Indian American Attitude Survey. This is joint work with my colleagues Sumitra Badrinathan, who is a professor at American University in Washington, and Devesh Kapoor, who is at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And, you know, I don't think that with the election just a few days away, I need to tell everyone why we're having this conversation at this time. But the question does arise from time to time. People ask, why is it that you care so much to study what's happening with the Indian American diaspora? So I thought I would start there. You know, I think the first comment to make is that there are about 5.2 million people of Indian origin residing in the United States, about 4 million people who are 18 and above, and about 2.6 million Indian Americans who are eligible to vote in this presidential election. This is a small population when looked at as a percentage of the overall US electorate, but it's a rapidly growing one. The census estimates that the Indian American community grew by around 50% between 2010 and 2020. You can see from this graph here, this tracks the US immigrant population over the last several decades. And you can see now that Indians have taken over all other Asian American groups when it comes to the size of the population. They're now the second largest immigrant group in the United States after Mexican Americans. Of the foreign-born population, that is people born in India or abroad who immigrated to the United States, 70%, 70, came after the year 2000, right? So we tend to think perhaps of my parents' generation, which came in the late 1960s as the kind of surge generation, but that really was a tiny generation compared to what we're seeing in the post-2000 era. So this is a growing population. It's also one that I'm sure all of you have seen these numbers before, has done very well. So they have become attractive voters to both major political parties. What you see on your left, this is data from the Pew Research Center. It shows that the median annual household income for Indian Americans back in 2019 was about $120,000. The median for all Asian Americans was $86,000, right? So the Indian Americans were quite an outlier. Similarly, they have amongst the lowest poverty rates of all other Asian origin groups. If you look at data from 2023, according to the US Census, Indian Americans now, the median household income is around $153,000. On the right-hand side, you could see Indian Americans are also outliers in terms of the percentage of them who have a bachelor's degree or more. 7 out of 10 Indian Americans have at least a college degree, while the median for all Asians is 50%. So this is a group that is increasingly seen by political parties as potential campaign donors, as influential members of their communities, and a vote mobilizers. And that's, I think, why we're seeing unprecedented attention being showered on them by both the Democratic and Republican parties. Of course, there's a third important reason I think it's worth studying this group, which is, of course, for the first time in the nation's history, we have a presidential candidate of Indian origin. 4 years ago, we had history made by having the first vice presidential nominee of Indian origin. And now 4 years later, of course, Kamala Harris is running for president. Now, although she has repeatedly said that she was raised identifying as a Black woman, Harris has also repeatedly embraced her Indian heritage. And that's important because there is existing research which suggests that Indian Americans are more inclined to vote for candidates who share their ethnicity, more so even than other Asian origin groups, right? So that co-ethnic link is something that could be quite powerful. Last but not least, I think it's an important group to study because there is data, national data, to suggest that the affinity that Asian Americans have felt with the Democratic Party, which has been their traditional home, that affinity might be weakening. So if you could look at this data here, which is the share of the two-party vote going to Democrats and Republicans from Asian Americans writ large, you can see particularly in the post-2016 era, there's been a decline, right? A decline of almost 15 percentage points away from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party. So I think one of the questions that has been highlighted this campaign season is whether or not we're going to see a continued drift away of Asian Americans and within them Indian Americans from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party. So with all of that as background, the objective of this survey that my colleagues and I carried out was to put together a foundation of robust, credible, independent data that can characterize the political attitudes and preferences of the Indian American community. This is something that we started 4 years ago in our first survey, which was the 2020 Indian American Attitude Survey. And this, what I'm going to present today, is our second wave. In each case, the survey was carried out just on the eve, just a few weeks before the presidential election. So it gives us a nice up-to-date snapshot of where the community's political leanings stand as we speak today. For those of you who haven't seen the report, it's available on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website. But as we're all now used to scanning various QR codes and menus and so on, if you do have a phone in your room and you haven't seen the report, you can use your camera app on your phone, put in this QR code, and it will take you directly to the link. It's a 10,000 word, pretty exhaustive report, but it has a very short 1.5-page summary at the beginning if you don't want to wade through all the details in fine print and just get a glimpse at our kind of big takeaways. Let me just say a couple of words about methodology. This was a survey which has 841 respondents. We're focusing just in what I'm going to talk to you about today on the US citizen subsample. Obviously, when talking about political leanings, we want to focus on those who can actually vote. That subsample is 714. Just to give you a sense, a lot of people look at 714 and say, well, that's not such a big number. But most of the surveys you see, many came out today from the New York Times, from the Economist, CBS survey, are national surveys of about 1,000 people to characterize the views of the entire US population, right? So we feel very comfortable with this sample. It gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 3.7%. So you can keep that in mind. There's obviously an average I'm going to present to you, but there's some variance or statistical noise around that average. It's an online survey conducted by our partners at YouGov between September 18th and October 15th. YouGov has a proprietary panel of over 500,000 active US participants. This is really the kind of new way in which survey research is going. The old-fashioned ways of doing kind of random phone calls, we're seeing really, really bad response rates. And as a result, that's introducing a lot of bias into our surveys. So more and more organizations are moving towards panel surveys where people go through a double opt-in process to take these surveys, but then you have a very rich set of characteristics about who these people are. And then because you know what the distribution of the population is from the US Census, of Indian Americans. You can then match and weigh your data appropriately, thinking about representativeness of gender, of age, of education, of political affiliations, and so on and so forth. So this is the methodology that kind of underlies the report. This just gives you a sense, this table, of what our data looks like relative to the ACS, the American Community Survey, which is the US Census. You can see here, if you look at the left-hand column, that's our data. We have a higher percentage of US citizens in our population. That's partly by design, because we're interested, again, in looking at voting habits. But if you look at sort of the gender composition, the age composition, those who are married, who have college degrees, it matches pretty well. Our survey seems to be on the lower end of the median annual household income spectrum. I wouldn't take that number too seriously. There's, asking people to back estimate their median household income is a very noisy measure. And we just have one question on the survey which asks about that, rather than going to a detailed thing about each person's salaries and their benefits and taxes and so on and so forth. So this is a rough ballpark, but I think broadly speaking, a pretty good sample on which to study. This is the geographic distribution. The size of these bubbles here in blue tell you how big our sample was. Unsurprisingly, the biggest sample comes from those states where we have the largest Indian American population. So that includes Texas, of course, but California, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Those together make up the big 6 states. Okay. So there are 5 underlying questions that motivated our work. And in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to kind of unpack the answers to these questions. The first is, how can we characterize Indian Americans' political and ideological affiliations? Number 2, how are they likely to vote in the 2024 presidential election? And how does that vote, or that vote intention, vary according to key demographic characteristics we might care about, like gender, like age, for instance? How do Indian Americans evaluate prominent political leaders, especially fellow Indian American politicians? There have been quite a few on both sides this election year. Number 4, how is Kamala Harris's presence on the ballot impacting political attitudes and voter enthusiasm among Indian Americans? And last but not least, what are the specific policy issues that are animating the Indian American community this year as they cast their vote? And so I'm going to go through those one by one, and then end with just a couple of words about, what I see as the kind of big takeaways or broader implications of the finding of this data. Let me start with political and ideological affiliations. We find in our sample that 47% of respondents identify as Democrats, 21% identify as Republican, and 26% identify as independent, neither Democrat nor Republican. This number for Democrats has actually come down somewhat. It was about 56% in 2020, and it's come down to 47%. The Republican number looks like it stayed the same, but when you ask independents, which way do you lean? Do you lean more to the left, or do you lean more to the right? We have more of those independents who say that they lean to the right. So that entire decline from 56 to 47% of those who identify as Democrats. If you look a little further, Republicans are gaining that ground. And actually the number of true independents in the sample is only about 14%, right? Once you dig a little bit deeper and you push independents to take one side. So I'm just showing you the broad data, but there's some nuance attached to that. The second thing we ask is, how people identify ideologically, right? Do you find yourself left of center? Do you find yourself in the middle? Do you find yourself on the far right? And so we've given people this standard kind of 7 categories, going from extremely liberal to extremely conservative. And what we find is that 55% of Indian Americans report or identify as being left of center, right? They're either slightly liberal, or extremely liberal. Only about 18% put themselves on the conservative end of the spectrum, with about 26% identifying as moderates. Now, what's interesting here is that in contrast to the data that I just showed you on partisan affiliation, there are actually more Indian Americans in 2024 identifying as left of center than there were in 2020. One way of making sense of that, which seems like a contradiction, is it could reflect some disappointment with the Democratic Party, maybe some unhappiness with the Democratic nominee, or even just the effect of a kind of populist like Trump, who doesn't very neatly fit into simple ideological categories, right? Because he's kind of broken with several decades of kind of conservative orthodoxy. Okay, now this is obviously, I think, the kind of the entree. What I showed you thus far has been the appetizer. How are Indian Americans likely to vote in the 2024 presidential election? What we find is that 6 out of 10, 60% Indian Americans plan to vote for Kamala Harris this election year. 31% plan to vote for Donald Trump. 5% will vote for a third-party candidate, and 4% of citizens who are eligible to vote do not intend to vote. What does this look like compared to 4 years ago? Well, we do see a modest decline in support for the Democratic Party. So in 2020, if you look at that dark blue bar, you can see that 68% of Indian Americans supported Joe Biden. That's come down to 60%, down by 8 percentage points. And that decrease is correspondingly the size of the increase voting for Trump. So you had 22% 4 years ago backing Donald Trump. This year, 31%, right? So that is an important shift that we're seeing over time. Now, again, remember, there's a margin of error in the survey of plus or minus 3.7%, right? So when you think about an 8 percentage decline, that could be more like a 4 percentage decline, or it could be as big as a 12 percentage point decline. 8% is roughly the average, but we think it's meaningful enough to take notice of. Okay, how does Indian Americans fare if you look at the country as a whole? So what I've shown you here is data from various other surveys conducted at the same time as our own, and showing you how they plan to vote. So the first column is the white population, followed by the Black, Hispanic, Asian American, and Indian American population. And then you can see across how they plan to vote for Harris, Trump, other, not sure, or will not vote. Indian Americans are roughly in line with Asian Americans as a whole. 64% of Asian Americans plan to vote for Harris. That's 61% of Indian Americans. Indian Americans are slightly more enthusiastic or supportive of Harris than Hispanics, where 58% plan to vote for her. 37% plan to vote for Trump. But you could see here that the strongest support for the Democratic Party continues to come from Black Americans, right? Where nearly 8 out of 10 plan to vote for Harris. And you can see the white population really is the only racial demographic that is more pro-Trump than pro-Harris, right? About 52%, a bare majority of white Americans plan to support Donald Trump in this election. So what I've shown you right now is a kind of macro aggregate. There are some interesting sources of demographic variation, and I want to just spend some time talking about 2 or 3. Let me start with gender. We've heard a lot this election year about a major gender gap in terms of who is supporting Harris versus who is supporting Trump. Women have really broken for Harris, while men are favor Trump. How does this look if we look at Indian Americans? Well, interestingly enough, we see the same gender divide. 67% of women plan to vote for Harris this election. Just 22% of women plan to vote for Trump. But the margin is not so great when it comes to men. 53% of men plan to vote for Harris, and 39%, a much larger share, plan to vote for Trump, right? So this is the first time ever since people have been collecting data on Indian Americans that we have seen any existence of a gender divide. When I made this presentation 4 years ago, one of the things I pointed out is that men and women behave exactly the same. And we're seeing a really strong difference 4 years on. There's a second source of interesting variation, which has to do with age. I've given you here respondents broken into 3 age buckets, 18 to 29. Those are the youngest voters. They include first-time voters, people who are 30 to 50 roughly, and then people who are 50 and above. You can see here that it's actually amongst people who are 50 and older where Harris gets the most support in our community, right? 7 out of 10 vote for Harris, and about 55, 56% of younger Indian Americans. So they still favor Harris, but not quite as much as older Indian Americans. And I think this might come as a surprise to a lot of people who tend to think, well, people who are younger, they tend to be more liberal, more progressive, but we're actually seeing an interesting trend develop in the Indian American community. Now, what I want to do next is take that data on gender that I just showed you and this data on age and put it together, because I think this in some ways is one of our most important and striking findings. What you see here again is women who 1839, women who are 40 and up, men who are 18 and 39, and men who are 40 and up. And you can see that amongst 3 of the 4 categories, there is overwhelming support for Kamala Harris, right? Men, women of all ages, young, old, older men who are above 40. But look at that third column, men between the ages of 18 and 39. They actually show a plurality of them support Donald Trump, right? 48% versus 44% of Harris. So if you go back to the graph I showed you earlier, showing you that there has been a slight Republican drift amongst Indian Americans over the past 4 years, almost all of that drift can be accounted for by younger Indian American males, right? Let me just show you, and let me just say, actually, if you look at data across demographics, you're seeing a similar pattern, right? It's true also amongst Latino men and African American men that younger men tend to be more open to voting for Donald Trump than either women of their race or older people of their race. Last thing I want to put together here is data on the nature of one's citizenship and gender. So, you know, we look at 2 categories here. You can either be a naturalized citizen, born elsewhere, immigrated to the US, got citizenship, or be US born. And you can see the top 3 bars: naturalized women, say who were born in India, got their citizenship, US born women, naturalized men, all of them almost identical, right, in the extent of support for Harris and Trump. But look at that last bar of US born men. Again, we're seeing an advantage for Donald Trump amongst this group, right? So the demographic that seems to be most pro-Trump this year are Indian American men under the age of 40 who are US born as opposed to naturalized citizens born abroad. Okay, let me go on to the third. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and we can come back to some of those figures. How do Indian Americans evaluate prominent political leaders, especially those who also come from the Indian American community? Let me walk you through this graph because at first glance it appears complicated, but it's actually quite simple. There is a methodology that is used in American politics called a feeling thermometer, where you ask people about a political party or individual and ask to rate them on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is the least favorable, 50 is you're sort of indifferent to that person, and 100 is the most favorable. The gray circles that you see here is the average response we get from our entire sample. The blue is what Democrats tell us, and the red is what Republicans tell us. So take the first row, Kamala Harris. She has a rating of 63 out of 100. So on average, people view her warmly, right? She's above that 50% threshold. But Democrats give her a 78, right? So Democrats are quite bullish, quite favorable on Kamala Harris. Republican respondents, on the other hand, give her a 42, right? Which is kind of just below that 50% threshold. And you can see here that the Democratic Party at large, Tim Walz, slightly less popular, but kind of in the same ballpark as Harris. Then go to the bottom couple of lines. These are all Republicans. Usha Vance, the Indian American wife of J.D. Vance, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy, 2 Indian Americans who contested elections on the Republican side, but were defeated by Donald Trump. And then the Republican Party itself, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance. So the average rating for all of those Republican individuals is below 50, right? So people by and large feel coldly about them. And you see a mirror image, right? Democrats tend to look at those Republicans quite poorly, and Republicans look at them more favorably, particularly Donald Trump. If you look at that next to last line, right? Republicans give Trump their highest rating, 77, right? Conversely, Democrats give Donald Trump their lowest rating, only a 24. One thing I just want to point out is this is evidence of something we see in the population at large. We call it political polarization, right? Where depending on your views, you have a very different assessment of how good or how bad a politician is. But one interesting thing about this chart is we actually see evidence of asymmetric polarization. In other words, Democrats tend to rate Republicans much more unfavorably than Republicans tend to rate Democrats, right? So look at the Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris. Republicans give her a 42, which is actually not that bad, right? Democrats give Donald Trump a 24, right? So by and large, there's on the whole, the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians are not as disliked as those on the bottom half of your screen. One of the things we wanted to explore is how people view Nikki Haley, because there was a certain degree of excitement in the Indian American community about her when she was in the primaries contesting against Donald Trump. And so we asked people, if you could go back, who did you prefer? Did you prefer to see Nikki Haley as the Republican nominee, or did you prefer to see Donald Trump? And 44% of respondents said we actually prefer Nikki Haley. 31% say they prefer Donald Trump. 17% are kind of indifferent between the two, and 8% say they don't know, right? So if there could be a do-over, there are a lot of Indian Americans who would have liked to have seen Haley. But what's interesting is then when you ask the follow-on question, okay, assume Haley was the Republican nominee, how would you vote in a hypothetical Haley versus Harris, two women, both with some Indian heritage? How would you vote between them? Overwhelmingly, people support Harris, right? 61% say they would vote for Harris, only 20% say they would vote for Haley. So that number for Haley is actually down from what the Trump number is. Now, the caveat here is obviously Haley is not a candidate, and if she were a candidate, people would have a lot more media exposure to her. She'd be a lot better known. So it's not an apples to apples comparison because Harris has been in the nominee. We've all been talking about her for the last several months. But we thought it was an interesting thing to do to see whether or not Haley's Indian roots would somehow boost her numbers overall, and we don't necessarily find evidence of that when you just look at a simple head-to-head matchup between Democrats and Republicans. Okay, fourth question is, how is Harris specifically, her presence on the ballot impacting political attitudes and voter enthusiasm? And this has been the subject of a lot of conversation. That you might have read stories in places like the New York Times with some skeptical Indian American voices saying, well, we're not sure Harris is really Indian because she's only half Indian and she primarily identifies as Black, while others have documented a lot of enthusiasm amongst Indian Americans saying she's one of ours, it's history making, we really have to rally behind her. So we wanted to try to take a temperature of how people felt, looking across the length and breadth of the country. The first question we asked is whether Harris's selection as a presidential candidate made Indian Americans more or less likely to vote. What we find is that more than half, 51%, say yes, Harris's selection as the presidential candidate makes me more likely to vote. 1 in 3 say it made no difference whatsoever. 12% said it actually made me less likely to vote. Okay, so by and large, people seem to be excited about Haley. But remember, you can be motivated to vote in favor of somebody, but you can also be mobilized to vote against somebody, right? And so it's possible that part of what we're picking up here is people who are saying, well, Harris is the nominee, and I definitely don't want to vote for her. So then we ask the follow-on question. Does the selection of Harris as a candidate make you more or less enthusiastic about the Democratic ticket, right? So here it's not just about turning out to vote, but do you see the Democratic ticket in a more favorable light? 48% say yes. Harris's nomination, makes me more enthusiastic about the Democratic ticket. 28% say it makes no difference, and 20% say it makes me less enthusiastic. As you would suspect, these numbers vary by partisanship, right? So most of that 20% of people who are saying it makes me less enthusiastic are people who identify as belonging to the Republican Party. Okay, now imagine you're somebody who is enthusiastic about Harris's nominee. We wanted to figure out what is it that makes you so excited about Kamala Harris's nomination. And the number one response, the most popular response voiced by 26% of those people is Harris is likely to be a liberal and progressive president. The next most popular answer was, well, she's just a younger candidate. Interestingly, the third most popular category is people believe Haley will be a centrist or a moderate, right? So you have people both who believe she's going to be more liberal and progressive, as well as people who think she's going to be right down the center. And they cite both of those reasons as is voting for her. I want to draw your attention closer to the bottom of this screen. Only 7% of people say that the reason Harris's selection makes them more enthusiastic is because she's a woman. And only 7% say it's because she's an Indian American, right? So those are relatively minor factors for a lot of Indian American voters. They tend to focus more, for instance, on what kind of president she's going to be in terms of her ideology. We can also do the flip side, which is those people who said, you know, I'm not enthusiastic about Harris. Well, why aren't you? And the number one response was she's too inexperienced. 19% of people said that. 18% said, look, I already made up my mind. And 17% said that she's too liberal, right? She's too liberal for my taste. Okay, coming on here to the end of the presentation, I just want to end by talking about the policy issues that seem to be animating the Indian American community this election year. We asked them, you know, when you go to cast your ballot this November, what is the most important election issue to you? Perhaps not surprisingly, the number one answer was inflation, prices, right? We've been hearing a lot in the media about voters being upset about the price of things, the price of gas, the price of real estate, the price of groceries, the price of clothing, and so on and so forth. That clearly shows up in the data. But one of the things which surprised us is look at those next two bars. You have jobs in the economy, not that surprising, but abortion comes up as the second most important election issue. If you rewind the clock to 2020, abortion wasn't a hugely salient issue for Indian American voters. But now, of course, in the wake of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decisions, you also have many Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade. You have numerous states who have abortion ballot initiatives or referenda. You're seeing this become a top tier issue for Indian Americans, something that actually in other questions in the survey, which I don't have time to show you today, abortion also pops up as something important, especially for Democrats and for women. One thing that I want to highlight from this long list of issues that people might care about is only 4% say that US-India relations is their most important election issue, right? And I think often in the discourse, this gets a lot of attention. People saying, well, I think Harris is going to be bad for India, or I think Trump is going to be good for India. And while people may have those views, it doesn't seem as if they are highly influential in shaping their vote choice, right? Indian Americans tend to vote like all other Americans, right? Which is based on bread and butter kind of kitchen table issues. One of the things we wanted to investigate is how people who identify as Democrats and people who identify as Republicans differ, and why is it that they identify the way they do. So we asked people who are either Republicans or independents why they don't support the Democratic Party. And the number one response, the most popular response, 27% of respondents say the Democratic Party is weak on illegal immigration, right? That to us was quite a striking number. 17% said that the Democratic Party is too influenced by the extreme left. 15% say they don't pursue my preferred economic policies, right? So the fact that immigration scores as high as it does tells you that that's clearly an issue that resonates with a lot of people who choose not to support the Democratic Party. And then again, looking at the flip side, asking people why they don't support the Republican Party if they're Democrats or independents. Abortion is tied as the most important issue, right? 18% say the Republican Party, at least this avatar of the Republican Party, doesn't support my views on abortion. But also instructive is look at the other most popular responses. 18% say this edition of the Republican Party is too intolerant of minorities or too influenced by Christian evangelicalism, right? So these are structural concerns that people have with the state of the Republican Party as it stands today in 2024. Okay, let me come to an end here and just kind of briefly summarize what I think are the main kind of top line findings. The first is that Indian Americans remain committed to the Democratic Party, but their attachment has declined, right? We've seen a softening of Indian American support for the Democrats this election year. 6 in 10, 60% of Indian American registered voters intend to vote for Harris, but that is a decline from 2020. So our data from 2020 finds the split between Biden and Trump was about 70-20. 70 for Biden, 20 for Trump, another 10% for third parties or wouldn't vote. Now we've gone from 70-20 to 60-30, right? With, again, the remaining 10% either uncommitted or voting for a third party. So that is an important decline. As part of that, there is a striking new gender gap in voting preferences. For the first time ever, we are seeing a strong gender gap within the Indian American community, with women much more favorable towards Kamala Harris, while men, again, in aggregate, a majority of men will support Kamala Harris, but that a degree of support is much weaker than it is for women. Number 4, Indian Americans hold relatively tepid views on other prominent Indian American Republicans. Abortion has emerged, abortion and reproductive rights have emerged as a top tier policy issue, especially for Democrats and for women. And finally, where we kind of ended off on the last slide, the Republican disadvantage with Indian Americans and Indian American voters is rooted very much in policy, right? There's still a strong segment of the Indian American community which views the Republican Party as simply out of sync with its core beliefs and kind of values and policy issues. Let me just end here with just a couple of implications about how to think about Indian Americans in the broader kind of American voting public, right? And let me start by saying that I think we need to reevaluate our assumptions about voting behavior of immigrant communities and visible minorities, right? There were books written years ago about how, demographics is destiny. And as the US becomes more diverse, more racially diverse, that is going to benefit the Democratic Party because those are the voters that it is speaking to. But obviously, this is not a linear project. We are seeing in survey after survey some degree of those minority voters shifting towards the Republican Party. Number 2 is that Harris's own identification as being Black and Indian, I think, led people to say, well, she's going to get much greater support from both of these communities than Joe Biden did in 2020. We don't find that to be the case. As with the overall US population, we had expected going into this survey that younger Indian American voters would be more pro-Harris than compared to their older counterparts. We also don't find that. We find actually older Indian Americans above the age of 40, 50 as being the most pro-Harris in the entire group. Given India's conservative kind of patriarchal society, one might have expected that naturalized men born in India, immigrated here, would be more pro-Trump than US-born younger males under 40. Again, we don't find that to be the case. Number 5, the general impression is that white voters are the ones who are most concerned about illegal immigration. But it turns out so are many immigrants, right? Whether they be Indian Americans or Hispanics, people who came to this country through legal means are quite upset about a perception that illegal immigration has gotten out of control. A lot of the focus in the media narratives leading up to this election was about racial polarization, religious polarization, but the gender divide is something else that is really quite stark. Like I said before, it's something we hadn't seen in this community, whether it's here to stay, whether it's a one-off because of Trump and his particular character and the way he speaks and what he bats for remains to be seen. But it is something that really pops out of the data. Last but not least, just I think a call for all of us who are in the kind of analyst class to be very careful of a very kind of simple black and white or binary narratives of what drives voting behavior, because I think we see time and time again that we actually know a lot less than that we think we do, and these kinds of surveys can give us a general snapshot in time, but obviously things can change very quickly. One final word about what comes next. This is an ongoing project. After the election, we will publish a report on how Indian Americans look at the state of US-India relations and India's own trajectory after the May 2024 Indian general elections. We'll also look at how Indian Americans look at their own identity, their own social realities, questions of class, of identity, of integration, and so on and so forth. And one of the other things we're planning on doing is trying to tease out more finely the relative merits of ethnicity, religion, and partisanship. To what extent are Indian Americans motivated to vote for fellow Indian Americans, even if that person is a Republican and doesn't share their views, or is a Democrat and doesn't share their views? How much does being Indian and sharing that Indianness trump everything else? So that's something that we want to dig into. Let me just end here. I've given you my email. If you have further questions or ideas, please do reach out. This is meant to be a public good, a public service. We are a nonprofit organization that puts this together. If you or your friends are interested in supporting the work we do and making sure that this is something we can do after every election and also in between elections, I would love to hear from you. And with that, I look forward to your questions and your comments.
All right. Thank you, Milan. I am so grateful to you for all of these findings and to the FIS for bringing us together. I think this is an uncertain moment. I think a lot of us are trying to figure out what is happening in our world, and this is one of those forums where we can kind of collectively do that. I've been doing this for a while as a journalist. I'm just thinking back to early in my career when I was on staff at India Abroad, and I covered both the Democratic and Republican national conventions 20 years ago. This is 2004. You might remember the young Black state senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, who delivered the keynote address at the Democratic convention at the Fleet Center in Boston. Very exciting times, but at the time, our community was much smaller. It had far less political clout, and it certainly wasn't on either presidential ticket. And that fact was completely, I think, unimaginable. We didn't have data like what Milan has, what you've given us. So I think we kind of listened to the loudest voices in the community, which tended to be I don't know, hotel and motel owners and doctors groups and whatnot. As you mentioned earlier, today we are now the largest immigrant group in this country after Mexican Americans. A couple other factoids which I'll throw out before we start discussing your findings, which I think is quite interesting. There are almost 250,000 of us who have become citizens, which is to say eligible voters in just the last 4 years. If you look at South Asians overall, there are nearly 400,000 South Asian American voters in the 10 most hotly contested swing states. So that lends itself to I think political significance and clout that can really tilt elections. There are different subgroups. You can always split it in different ways, but I do think that's something that we shouldn't take for granted. And then finally, this is a very fast-growing community. It's also a highly engaged community. In the last couple of presidential elections, Indian American voter turnout was the highest of any Asian American group, on par really with the white voter turnout, according to AAPI data. In the last election, which is to say in 2020, 71% of Indian Americans who could vote did vote, which was a 9% rise from 2016. So I think, there's clearly a lot in which we should be sort of doing this kind of introspection about what we're doing right, if you will, in terms of engagement. At the same time, I do think it's worth also pointing out that as our community grew in size in the last 10, 20, 30 years, if you look at Milan's graph from earlier, we couldn't necessarily have anticipated that we would see this growth in white nationalism in the last so many years. Donald Trump said that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. He said that at a campaign rally in New Hampshire. This isn't just about illegal immigration, although that's sort of driving a lot of the discourse. Just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump's closest advisors and allies are drawing up plans to restrict many forms of legal immigration, some of which could affect the ability of businesses to hire foreign workers. So a lot is at stake in this election. And with that in mind, Milan, let's start diving into what you've discussed and what you haven't already kind of touched upon. As you know, the percentage of our community that is supporting Harris, it's dipped noticeably, but it still remained pretty high over many years. And I'm wondering if it's clear to you to what extent that is due to the Democratic Party's commitment to minority rights. Is it clear? Do you think that's been sort of a constant? In one of your charts, you mentioned concerns about minorities. You mentioned Christian evangelicalism. How should we infer that?
Great comments, Arun, and really good question. I ended by saying that I thought that there were structural barriers that would maybe limit the movement of Indian American voters away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And I think one of the things that has shown up consistently in our work and the work of others is that a large number of Indian Americans continue to feel that the general way in which the Republican Party has progressed has gone in a anti-immigrant, kind of anti-minority kind of way that is not open to, say, kind of diverse viewpoints, diverse religious tendencies, and so on and so forth. That came up very strongly both in our 2020 survey as well as our 2024 survey. But as you mentioned, right, there has been a narrowing. So how do we understand that narrowing? I think it in part has to do with Trump, right? And here I would say, two things. One is that I think there has been a sense of resentment that has been cultivated that some Indian Americans believe, that said, look, we came the honest way, we came the hard way, we had to suffer all the hurdles of coming to this country legally. And now you have people who have chosen to circumvent that route. And we have a problem with that. And obviously that has been one of the touchstones of Trump's campaign. I think the second, frankly, is a feeling that, the economy was just better. And, this is just a simple bread and butter issue. And I want things to be like they were, 4 years ago, or at least pre-pandemic. Of course, it's hard to say whether this is a transitory shift or permanent shift, but I wouldn't read too much into the data to myself to say, like, this is now the new normal and we're set at 60-30, right? Because I do think Trump is such a unique character that he really scrambles a lot of politics. Let me just give you one last example. I mentioned earlier that, more Indian Americans are identifying as being left of center, right? So that would seem like such a contradiction. How are they identifying more as left of center, but then not with the Democrats, which is the left of center party? And I think that has to do with Trump's own ideological flexibility, right? So Trump is taking positions on certain issues, take trade policy, which are policies that are more protectionist or nativist, which we associated with, parts of the old left, right? Now, of course, he has a lot of conservative policies too on abortion and climate and so on and so forth. But he doesn't fit that ideological spectrum very neatly.
And I mean, and to your point, I mean, look at how it's the GOP who's now presenting themselves as sort of the anti-war party, right? It's Biden. It's under Biden who we've seen, the Ukraine-Russia war. It's under Biden where we've seen what's happened in the Middle East. This is sort of unimaginable in previous eras that we would be seeing the Democrats sort of playing defense on militarism or pro-war, if you will, optics.
Yeah, I mean, I would just give one slight caveat to that, and I think that's right. in the national theater of politics, this version of the Republican Party has been playing that role, right? And has been talking about America's forever wars, taking a different stance on Russia, Ukraine. But the Republican Party does have many tents. And what Trump and J.D. Vance are saying is not what Ted Cruz is saying or what Josh Hawley is saying, which is we need to spend more and more money on the Defense Department and actually beef up the military, right? And then you have more classic foreign policy kind of Republicans on Capitol Hill, for instance, who continue to believe in things like foreign aid and so on. So it's a smaller number. But they do have there is some dissension within the ranks about how much we want to go down this path, right? Because I think Trump has, again, scrambled this a bit. And I think everyone is trying to make sure they're on the right side of the line. But there are internal debates within the Republican Party about how America should be projected and promoted abroad.
Sure. When you look at those numbers suggesting that, I think you said 55% of Indian Americans who you surveyed are left of center. To what extent have you seen evidence that that there is a pro-Palestinian constituency that is animating anti-Harris sort of sentiments?
So we don't pick up very much in our data. Which, on the one hand is somewhat surprising because it has been something that's been talked about a lot in the media. It is true that about 43% of respondents in our sample feel that the United States has been too supportive of Israel and not supportive enough of Palestine, right? So that's more than 4 in 10. But we don't see a very sharp correlation between that and how people are voting, right? So our takeaway is, and we also didn't dig perhaps too deeply into this, but our takeaway is that while there might be some upset around issues of Gaza, that it hasn't fundamentally changed people's voting patterns. And again, people are, even if they're upset with the Biden policy, find Trump perhaps a bridge too far.
For me, I think one of the biggest surprises, if not the single biggest surprise from your findings, is this gender gap. Did you feel the same way? Or did that really did we caught off guard by those findings?
Hugely. I remember when we did this presentation 4 years ago, and gender was one of those things where it came up on a slide and you had nothing to say because the numbers were virtually identical between men and women. It wasn't even worth commenting upon. Now, of course, Arun, in the run-up to these elections, we've heard a lot about gender. It's all over the media now, this question of a gender divide. But again, I did not, from my own anecdotal observation, pick up so much of this gender divide in the Indian American public. But the data kind of speaks very loud and clear, right? That there's a divide that very much mirrors the divide that we're seeing, in the country as a whole. And it was really stark, if you remember that graph I showed you, when you look at gender by age, to see that movement really concentrated amongst Indian American men under the age of 40, right? You see pretty strong support across the board in the 3 other quadrants. It's really that one where she has blood support.
Are there other aspects that you see a divide between those who are, say, U.S. born versus naturalized voters in your sample?
So just elaborate on what you mean by that.
Do you see ways in which within the community you see a divide? Because I think you referred to how these are young men, but cutting across gender, do you see other ways in which people who are born or raised here differ from people who are immigrants who came here and were naturalized?
Well, what's interesting about that is that, across a couple of different measures, we actually find that the older, the naturalized citizens tend to be older on average, right? Than the ones who are then native born, who tend to be younger, which makes sense. they are actually much more stalwart in their views in terms of they're much more in sync with where the Democratic Party is than younger folks, younger men in particular. So whether it's how they view the Republican Party, again, as I said, as being particularly antithetical or hostile to immigrants or to minorities, or in terms of how much they care about an issue like climate change, for instance, we're seeing those views much more pronounced amongst naturalized citizens than we are amongst. I want to make a distinction here amongst U.S.-born men. U.S.-born women do not think the same way as U.S.-born men. They actually have much more in common with their older counterparts than U.S.-born men. And now, look, the big question is what's going on with men under 40. And I don't have a great answer for you based on this survey. It's going to take a lot more digging. But let me just put out 3 hypotheses from what others have found thinking about this question in other communities, right? The first is this feeling that, the kind of American dream has been drastically curtailed, that it's just much harder to achieve the kind of socioeconomic mobility that we would like. And so you want to raise a family, you want to live in a nice neighborhood, you want to have a nice house. That's just much more difficult to do. And these are things that many young men feel are traditional concerns of young men, right? And that is part of their gender role. The second is, how much of this is just misogyny, right? I mean, just to be blunt, how much of it is just skepticism about we don't think Kamala Harris has what it takes because she's a woman, right? I mean, we certainly can't rule that out. I can't provide you any data from this survey which answers yes or no, but I think it's something worth considering. I think the third is that, the nature of information flows and content. I mean, you should be answering this because you're actually in the media business. I think is very different for younger men, and we're seeing that, right? This kind of conservative kind of podcast culture, right, is targeting younger men with particular messages, right, about America being run over by illegal immigrants, the American dream crashing. This idea that the left is caught up in all this woke identity politics, and so one way or another, it's possible that those messages are resonating, even within younger men in our community. Which, again, in my mind, I don't think of as the natural demographic, but these trends are so consistent across different racial and ethnic groups. I think there has to be some degree of similarities, if you look horizontally.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. You're definitely picking up on that. I think, and the President Trump, that is, he's clearly kind of owning that. I think just yesterday, one of his rallies, he, things that we've gotten used to not being unprecedented, if you will, but simulating a sex act while standing in, at a microphone speaking about his opponent, things that I think are meant to sort of invoke a very macho, no holds barred aspect, but we're also clearly repelling women and other people who are concerned about misogyny. We have a few questions I want to dip into from our viewers. People are here. A couple that have to do with wealth, and I'm gonna sort of refer to somebody from the Vavilala family, AS Vavilala, who is asking, Milan, do you find a direct correlation between high net worth amongst Indian Americans and their support of Trump based on tax policy? Is it all about money? And just to kind of pair that with something from Hiran Sharma, is wealth gap one of the primary reasons for Republican, which is to say wealthier / Democratic split support amongst Indian Americans? I don't know if your data actually tells us that, but your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think, look, there has always been this conjecture or feeling amongst the Republican Party that Indian Americans are naturally they naturally belong in the Republican Party, because Republicans would see themselves as the party of low business regulation, of low taxes, thinking about kind of hospitable investment climate and so on and so forth. We do see in the data a modest correlation, but it's not a statistically significant one. So in other words, people who are, say, make, below 50,000 or in that 50 to 100,000 category tend to be more inclined to vote Harris as opposed to those who are the upper echelons, but the differences are not significant, right? So although it's something that is used as a kind of common trope that, oh yeah, well, Indian Americans, they do so well, median income's $153,000, they're going to vote right. We're just not seeing that. And there are other appeals that the Republican Party is making that seem to resonate, but actually the economic one is not the one that comes across in our data, which I think surprises a lot of people. But I think it comes back to where we were just a few minutes ago, right? I think people are looking at the basket of things the Republican Party is offering and evaluating whether or not they like it. They're not just looking at simple dollars and cents.
And one more question. This is from Suran Setumadhavan. Did the survey collect religion data? Wondering about the 13% who regarded abortion as the #1 issue. Was it because of gender or because of religion?
No, we did not find any. Well, let me just back up by saying that if you disaggregate religion of our respondents, as we do have data on that, the group that supports Kamala Harris with the greatest intensity are Muslim Indian Americans, followed closely by those who have no religious affiliation, which means they're either atheist, agnostic, or just simply have no religious identity that they care to disclose. So you have Muslims, agnostics, atheists, and then Hindus. Who are the third most. And then actually the group that is the most fragmented in terms of how they plan to vote are Christian Indian Americans, right? So that is the group upon where you see actually the highest levels of support for Trump. It's not majority support for Trump, but you do see much greater divided politics there. When it comes to the abortion issue, though, we don't see any relationship between religion. We do see a very, very strong one with partisan identity and gender, though.
I noticed in your report that you say that, let's see, Hindus are a little less likely to support Harris than non-Hindus. Does that sound right?
That's right. Yeah. So what I explained before is that, I gave you a number overall of 61% plan to vote for Harris. Okay, that number is about 68% for Muslims. It's about 64-65% for people who don't have a religious affiliation. That number is 58% for Hindus, right? And it's down around, if memory serves, around 50%, 50, for Christians, right? So that is, like I said, perhaps most evenly split across.
I mean, just getting back to the gender gap, I'm just struck by not just the figure that you talk with men in that 1839 category, but the leap from 2020, according to a survey, it was 23% who supported Trump in 2020, and it's 48, so it's more than double. It's really quite an astonishing rise. Did you say that kind of tracks? I mean, I know there's a lot of anecdotal talk about Black men, Latino men going. So you think this is consistent with that overall pattern, correct?
It's consistent with the overall pattern. In some cases, the delta, the change between over 4 years has not been as stark. In part, that's a reflection of the fact that male or female, either way, support for Trump was really low in the American community in 2020, right? So it's like a low base that really moved up. But survey after survey that's come out from credible organizations has found a similar shift amongst, say, Blacks, Hispanics, some Asians, not quite as large, and of course, amongst white Americans as well, where there is just a greater openness for Trump than there was last time. Now, how this plays out at the ballot box is a big question, because we know a couple of things, right? One is that we know that women are more likely to turn out than men. And we know that young people are much less likely to turn out than older people, right? So what someone says in a survey, obviously, you can't just read across as, well, that's what's going to happen in the election, because a lot of this has to do with, how people turn out and so on and so forth. One interesting thing, though, just about our community is that these are high propensity voters, right? So like 96% of people who are registered voters in our community are going to vote, right? So that's a astoundingly high percentage relative to the American population, right, which is much smaller.
Just another question or two. I'm just curious how you interpret these latest findings about the community based on previous findings. I'm specifically thinking of the current your 2021 report, Social Realities of Indian Americans.
Yeah.
Which I'll quote. Indian Americans regularly encounter discrimination. 1 in 2 Indian Americans reports being discriminated against in the past 1 year, with discrimination based on skin color identified as the most common form of bias. Somewhat surprisingly, Indian Americans born in the U.S. are much more likely to report being victims of discrimination than their foreign-born counterparts. I'm sure that you're sort of, drawing upon different sort of studies. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this and how you see it as informing, the latest findings.
Well, so I'm going to punt a little bit, because it's actually going to be the subject of its own report. As I mentioned, we're going to do one on foreign policy and then one kind of on social realities. And we'll come to this question because we do have updated data on people's perception of discrimination against the community, as well as their own firsthand experience. And so, I think one of the things that we're obviously going to be looking for is whether or not people who believe they've been discriminated against are fundamentally different or hold fundamentally different political views, right? For instance, we might think they may be more inclined to vote for the Democratic Party and see Trump and some of the kind of racial tropes or racist tropes we've seen as kind of off-putting. So we haven't gotten there yet. The other thing that we're, just to kind of whet people's appetite, that we've asked about is, one of the big debates that has animated the Indian American community over the past couple of years has been questions of caste, right? And to what extent does caste identity, which is rooted in India, traveling across the oceans and being replicated here, and to what extent do people think that's a significant issue? It's a minor issue. We're also asked people about, there have been various initiatives around the country to add caste as a category of in anti-discrimination laws and statutes, how people feel about that. So we haven't gotten the analysis there yet, so I'm not going to speculate, but it's something that is going to be coming up over the next couple of months.
All right. Well, someone else in the chat box, this is Lakshmi. I am going to venture that this is Lakshmi Parameshwaran, but just a comment, not a question. Noting how I mentioned Obama's rise in the 2000s.
Yeah.
What she writes is, he held 2 terms as the first Black president. In my involvement in Get Out the Vote efforts since 9/11, which is to say W's second term, George W. Bush, I observed great division and heated discussion among self-described Democrats in our community. Re Obama's skin color and Muslim middle name. In my phone banking with Indian Americans this election season, I found that the outlook on Harris is not as contentious as it was for Obama. Still, views of her as the quote-unquote other prevails, although in reality, she is like any other second-generation Indian American from a mixed-race family, which includes the families I am calling. Thank you for that comment. I'm going to see if there's any other questions. It looks like no. So I think, it's about 4:20 my time, 3:20 yours. On that note, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you so much, Milan. I know we could talk for a while longer, but I'm going to be respectful of everyone's time here and your own, of course, in Geneva, I guess. So thank you again for your report and for sharing it with all of us today.
May I request Sudhakar to give a formal vote of thanks to everybody? And from my side, It was a great session. Really appreciate it. Sudhakar?
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Foundation for India Studies, it is my privilege to extend a vote of thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Milan Vaishnav, and our moderator, Mr. Arun Venugopal. Dr. Vaishnav, your expertise and deep understanding of the electoral behavior, combined with your extensive research on the Indian diaspora, have provided us with a comprehensive overview of the voting patterns we can expect from Indian Americans in the upcoming elections. Your discussions based on available data from recent surveys of Indian Americans that characterize their political attitudes and preferences, ideology and affiliation, voter enthusiasm, these have really enlightened us. We are also inspired to reflect on our roles as active and informed citizens. I also express our gratitude for addressing the questions raised by our participants with such clarity and patience. I would also like to thank our moderator, Mr. Arun Venugopal. Your ability to break down intricate concepts and allow Dr. Vaishnav to present them in an engaging and accessible manner is truly commendable. The narratives and real-world examples you shared have added a practical dimension to our understanding, making this webinar very informative and relatable. Your unique way of involving our speaker in a meaningful dialogue has enriched our experience and provided us with valuable insights. A big thank you to our FIS founder and chairman, Mr. Krishna Vavilala. Your passion for community service, bringing us these timely and unique experiences and giving back to the community is remarkable, truly. Thanks to our MC, Mr. Hiren Sharma, for smoothly conducting the event, and to our advisors, Amanda Vavilala and Chandra Vavilala, for always being there to support our organization. Finally, and most importantly, I would like to thank each and every one of you online for attending the webinar. We appreciate your encouragement to our speaker and moderator and your contributions for a Q&A session. Your presence and participation have made this event a big success. We hope that you found this webinar to be a valuable experience. Thank you all once again and have a great evening.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank
Astaji,
you. Thanks, everyone.
for
Thank
holding the
you.
fort. Okay. Good night.
Good night.